You're listening to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series,
a dedicated series that explores all things net zero carbon and sustainability within the built environment.
Don't miss any future episodes. Subscribe at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series. I'm Julia Hatmaker, Deputy Editor at Place Northwest, and today we're talking about the UK's electrical grid, and it's an important topic because the grid and its issues are the monster underneath the bed in many of the country's sustainability ambitions. We've got Pegasus Group Senior Director of Property Simon Tarr and Senior Acquisition Surveyor Ben Thompson. Pegasus Group is a leading development consultancy specializing in planning, design, environment, economics, heritage, transport and infrastructure, and property. The company has considerable experience across the energy sector, including solar on and offshore wind, bioenergy, tidal power, energy from waste, anaerobic digestion, and hydropower. So, Simon, Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to throw this first question at you, Ben. Tell me what the grid is. What is the state of it?
So the grid is essentially the electrical network in the UK that stores and transports electricity from where it's generated to its end user, essentially. So it's sort of split up into two different divisions on a national level and a more regional local level, which we call the DNO, the Distribution Network Operator. So the general infrastructure was constructed in sort of the 40s, 50s, which probably flags the first initial issue of the age and the ability for that to be modified and brought up to date for the technology that we have now.
Right. So what is the capacity? I mean, are we good with the grid, or does the grid need help?
In short, no. In short, there are issues surrounding the available capacity for the likes of renewable energy projects. The electricity that the renewable energy projects generate, there's nowhere to put that. I say nowhere. There is a distinct shortage, shall we say.
The system, when it was built, was designed to carry a base load, a steady base load from coal-fired power stations. And now here we are 60, 70 years later, and we have a whole mix of energy generation. So we have sort of your base load, which is your nuclear power stations, and then we've got the renewable side of things, which is classed as intermittent generation. And because of the antiquated nature of our grid infrastructure, it is proving difficult to add more intermittent generation, which is one of the issues that we'll talk about in more detail.
Ooh, okay, grim picture, Simon, that you just painted for us there, you and Ben together. We touched on this a little bit. Why should we be concerned about the grid and its current capacity?
It's a point that often gets overlooked in the wider sort of press. Our Prime Minister came out a couple of weeks ago and said that he wanted to have all of the UK's electricity from clean energy sources by 2035, which is a great target to have. But to achieve that, a lot of work has to go on behind the scenes from a policy perspective and a cash investment perspective. So to get all of the UK's power from clean sources by 2035, we need to double our existing renewable energy generation, which is possible in theory in terms of offshore, onshore, wind, solar, all of the various different technologies that are available. But one thing that often gets overlooked is how that power is actually then used. So it needs to be generated, and then for that power to be put into the grid network, we need the infrastructure to be able to get into our homes and where we use the power.
I think that's the thing that's so shocking to me is like we could have all the great renewable energy we want. We could have solar panels everywhere up and down the coast. And yet if we can't actually get that energy to our homes to actually be used, it's pointless. There's no need in doing it.
Exactly, and it's something that has been an issue for a number of years now, where we are, but it's kind of at a crunch point now where we had the likes of Renewable UK sort of in response to Mr. Johnson's statement about all clean energy by 2035. They issued the onshore wind industry prospectus, which is basically a proposal to double the UK wind capacity to 30 gigawatts by 2030. And as part of that, they were offering to work with government to formulate plans and policies. And a recurring theme throughout that document is about the investment that is needed in the UK grid network to allow that to happen. Part of their suggested policy making is entitled Reforming Ofgem and investing in grid infrastructure to enable the development of sufficient capacity. So it is a significant issue.
So to take it all back to the renewables and things like that, we have discussed how, you could generate as much as you want, but the good news is we're actually having these discussions. And I suppose this wasn't a conversation we were having in the 1940s and 50s when we were making the grid. Is that about right, Ben?
Correct. And the way that technology has moved on in the renewables sector since sort of the early 90s, when the first projects were coming apparent, it has highlighted more the need for the additional capacity. So, for example, the likes of wind farms in the early 90s, we were looking at sort of 200 kilowatt wind turbines, where nowadays we're looking at between 8 and 10 megawatt wind turbines. So the actual capacity that is able to be produced has massively increased. The place to put the generated electricity hasn't, since the 40s, 50s, when the initial infrastructure was put in.
So this is kind of like a good problem to have. Like, technology has gone so far, yay! But there's this one crucial element that's been left behind. So I guess with that in mind, what can we do to salvage the grid?
It's an important question, and one there isn't an obvious and easy answer to, short of rebuilding it all, which isn't commercially viable. But a key point that the government need to recognise, and that is being lobbied for by various groups, including our UK, is that investment in our grid system is urgently needed. It's all very well and good coming out and making really positive statements about net zero emissions, etc. But to achieve those targets, there needs to be the background support to allow developers to actually connect projects to the grid, which is a problem that we're finding from certainly our clients within Pegasus Group, that there's plenty of available land sites that in theory have constraints that would allow them to be consentable, and we're going through that process. We've got a willing landowner. The only blocker to those projects being taken forward is available grid capacity, where grid offers are coming back at either there is no capacity, or the DNOs and National Grid are looking to charge those developers to actually upgrade wider parts of the network to the tune of tens of millions of pounds just to get that one small project connected to the grid, which it makes it not commercially viable. No developer is going to invest in upgrading 100 miles of 275 kV grid network just to get through a 40 megawatt solar farm. It's not commercially viable. So it's a key problem. What can be done about it? Short of investing in it, there are lots of things that the renewable energy industry are looking to do. And one thing the renewable energy industry is very good at is being very innovative. We've found that over the last 6 or 7 years since the ROC regime came to an end, we're looking at ways of making these things, these projects commercially viable. And we're now having to look at ways around the lack of grid capacity. So one thing that a lot of developers are exploring are private wire connections. So behind the meter, off grid, where you have a specific requirement for a new development, say a residential scheme or a very power hungry development that's an industrial manufacturing plant or something, and then you have a renewable power supply specifically to that project. So if it's a residential scheme, you find a piece of land within proximity to that to generate solar or wind, and you just run a cable from that generating asset and plug it into the on-site grid network. So you're not actually connecting into the wider distribution network at a DNO level. It is a private wire that powers specifically that project.
We talked a little bit about private wires actually in an earlier podcast with Pegasus. Andrew Cook was telling us about how that's the way to make a scheme that involves electrical vehicle charging units as green as possible. He's like, have a solar plant nearby that you can be plugged directly into. Because obviously, one of the key issues with electrical charging units is making sure you're getting your electricity in a sustainable way. And as you guys mentioned, it's hard to guarantee that with the grid right now, given the situation that it just can't hold as much as we need. So, is there anything else we can be doing? Ben, give me some optimism.
As Simon mentioned, tying a private renewable development onto an actual development, shall we say, of residential or commercial is a good way to avoid the issue. But it doesn't necessarily root down to solving the actual issue, which is the lack of available capacity currently. So it all comes back to the viability in that. Is it possible with the funds available? Does it stack up from a financial perspective to upgrade the grid in that particular network and particular area to make a scheme viable? So it's difficult, but as Simon mentioned, the renewables market is there due to the innovation and the research and development that has gone on over the last 20 years or so.
So we have talked about how it seems like the only thing to do then is to just kind of invest in the grid as like a primary, like if we're going to keep this grid concept going, it needs investment. Are we talking millions, billions, trillions of pounds here?
Yeah, it will be billions. I don't know how many miles of grid infrastructure there is in the UK, but it's thousands upon thousands. And the way it's upgraded currently is very piecemeal. So you have a small length of infrastructure upgraded for a specific reason. That there isn't a forward-thinking approach that at government level that says, well, if we upgrade this particular part of the network, then that will facilitate X number of megawatts of further renewable energy generation. Is very much the system as it is puts all the onus on the project development company to pay for it. So you make a grid application, and if you're applying for a 49.9 megawatt solar farm, for example, they only look at that in isolation. So they will look at the grid network and give you a price based on what it will cost to connect that 49.9 megawatt solar farm. What should be done is to look at it on a regional basis. There could be half a dozen 49.9 megawatt solar farms in an area that all have to do the same bit of upgrading work for that one piece of national grid or DNO electrical infrastructure, and they're all being given the same price, which as a standalone project basis level is just not commercially viable. But if they look at it as a group of projects and split the cost across those projects as a whole, then that would facilitate the further renewables growth, because those 6 projects would just pay a sixth of the cost, and it's much more likely to be commercially viable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, why wouldn't we pool our resources together on this? It sounds like this is a country problem and not just like a specific plot of land issue.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at sort of facts and figures about what's actually been happening over the last few years, there's only been 400 megawatts of solar capacity added since 2018. There's only been 1 gigawatt of renewables added in 2020, which is at the lowest level since 2007.
Wow.
Now, obviously, we had a difficult year last year with the impact of coronavirus, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't wider issues within the renewable sector that need to be dealt with and addressed to get to another 30 gigawatts by 2035. So it is a significant issue, and one that doesn't get talked about too much at government level, I don't think.
It strikes me too, one of the problems with this is it's a depressing topic. Like, it's not gonna be one that, like, encourages me to vote a certain way because the answer is it's gonna be a lot of money, and that's not a good political stance, I feel like, to take, whereas saying, "We're gonna have more renewables," is something that's positive and great and wonderful, even if people aren't reading the small print and finding out that it's not actually feasible down the
I think,
line.
yeah, that's a key point. I think if you look at renewables generally and look at the energy sector as a whole, if we can get another 30 gigawatts of onshore wind, for example, we could save the consumer £16 billion over the next decade, because we're not relying on external third-party gas pricing, or you're not so exposed to the wider energy market constraints. So if you can be self-sufficient and control your own energy generation, it makes a lot of commercial sense. That 16 billion equates to £25 per household per year over the next 10 years, which is a lot of money. And that money will have to be paid out at some point to get us the grid infrastructure required to deliver an additional 30 gigawatts of power. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult to predict the future. There's things that they could be doing, the things that they may be thinking about in terms of would it be beneficial to be incentivizing these schemes more from a developer's perspective. In that, if legislation was introduced to counteract that, in terms of, for example, a development must be self-sufficient in terms of energy production and energy use. If there was legislation there to assist that, I think there'd also have to be subsidies and incentivized payments to, going back to the financial side, the viability of it is very important from a developer's perspective, that they can make the project stack up in accordance with any legislation that may already be in place.
I guess this goes in with what you were saying about they need to be self-sustaining. Like, it sounds like then being like any major development needs to have a private wire is almost, one of the possible solutions. Or is that completely crazy and outrageous?
Yeah, or a contribution a financial contribution to an upgrade to the actual local grid. As Simon mentioned, that there could be 5 or 6 renewables projects within a 10-mile radius of each other that are all paying for the same thing. But if there was a scheme where we could chip together and do a mass upgrade rather than 6 mini upgrades, it may be a better way to get the national infrastructure upgraded on a quicker level to meet these targets for 2035, but also a way of incentivizing developers as well through a subsidy scheme.
I think a key point about private wire, it only enables one small project to come forward and be carbon neutral. It's not. It's benefiting one small project as opposed to a large scale solar project that can benefit 100,000 homes. So it's a narrow-minded approach generally, and is only a temporary solution on a small scale. If we want to hit the 2035 targets, it needs to be on a national level rather than a small bespoke solution to getting one particular project off the ground.
It does feel like the grid capacity is the ticking time bomb, basically. We've been putting it off for so long. I mean, obviously, Ben, you were telling us that this was made in the 40s and 50s. That's 70 years ago. People who were born then can retire. The grid should be able to retire now. Uh, and we've just been putting it off and off and off. Like you were even saying in the 90s, we started seeing there were slight issues with it. It feels like we're nearing the end of that ticking time bomb issue. Is that about right? Do we have many more years, or is it like solve it now?
That's difficult to say, but I think it's a balance between the advancing in technology and what we can get out of renewable projects nowadays compared to what we could get back then, and it's sort of meeting in the middle in that technology is getting better and the grid capacity is getting no bigger.
Yeah, I think a key point there is I think it is at the end of that bomb about to go off. We're finding that DNOs are asking renewable projects to curtail their output. So you apply for a grid connection and they say, well, yes, you can connect your 50 megawatt solar farm, but we reserve the right to curtail your output by up to 40%. So not only has a developer got to fund the development, pay for the grid connection, they've then got to manage the risk of only being able to supply 60% of the actually available electricity that could be generated. So it's a very short-sighted approach being taken now. Why should you go through a development process to then have to agree to a curtailment of your output just because the grid network doesn't or can't take all of the capacity that your project could generate? It's a very short-sighted approach right now, and I think it is very much coming to a head, and it will come to a head over the next 2 or 3 years, where the likes of Renewable UK and various developers and people such as ourselves that are trying to lobby government and trying to get the message heard that investment is needed sooner rather than later.
It feels like the grid is really similar to another aspect of our COP26 podcast series. We did a lot of podcasts on retrofitting. And one of the big aspects of that was like retrofitting is no longer optional. It's a necessity. Like most of the buildings here are still going to exist. The grid capacity issues are no longer optional. We can't just like think if we want to handle it and solve it. It's a necessity. We need to solve it. And
Absolutely.
yeah. Oh, well, okay. So this was a lot. I laugh because I'm going to cry otherwise. But to recap today's episode, which there is some hope for the future, the current state of the grid is not good. It's no bueno. It is old. It doesn't have the capacity. It's not kept up to date with the technology we can produce today. So if we want to be run largely by renewable energy, we just can't actually do it yet because we don't have the infrastructure in place. So we want to get that ambition, work on the grid capacity. And the downside is, even though it's something we need to do, it's expensive to do, and it's going to require a lot of hard work and pain and suffering and getting it through, because it sounds like we need to kind of just spend the money and make it happen. There are small solutions for individual schemes that are like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. A private wire can solve your individual scheme's problem, but it's not going to save the planet, and it's not going to solve the country's issues with it. But there's still time. We can solve this. We're just going to have to decide that we're all banding together to really focus and prioritize the grid. Am I right, Simon? Am I right, Ben? Did I miss something key?
Absolutely. I think it's very important to take a holistic view of this, and that and the industry does not expect government or the public purse to pay for this. They are very happy to invest, and they have been investing over many years, many millions of pounds, and that will continue. But the balance needs to be right. And if we can change the system and the process involved in connecting projects to the grid network so that there is that wider visibility. So it's not a queue system. You're first in the queue, take this offer or leave it, and then it goes to the next person in the queue. It's how can we all work together? We want 40 megawatts. The person in the queue wants 20. Can we band it together and share the cost between us? It's that approach that needs to be looked at, as opposed to the current system that is in place. And if we can do that, the future very much is bright, because the renewable industry in the UK is fantastic. It's full of very innovative and skilled people that want to make this work and achieve the government targets. We just need a few changes to a few bits of antiquated policy and infrastructure, and it will definitely happen.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Absolutely.
Ben, do you have any parting thoughts?
No, I just echo what you said in your closing statement, that it is like putting a Band-Aid, I'd say plaster, over a bullet wound. That those smaller schemes are just covering up the wider issue, and the one way out of this is to group together and spend the money that is required for the upgrades.
Yeah, and thanks for calling me out my Americanism. I will adapt to this country sometime soon, I hope. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me on this podcast. It was really informative, and I did enjoy it, even if I am a little depressed. I'm not going to lie at the end of this one. And thank you to the listener for tuning in for today's episode. If you want to learn more about Pegasus, you can go to pegasusgroup.co.uk. And if you want more podcasts about sustainability, you can check out Place Northwest podcast series all about COP26 and the sustainability issues facing the built environment. You'll find our podcast series wherever you listen to podcasts. So please subscribe. And while you're at it, why not leave a review? Just a thought, no pressure. You don't have to do it, it's good. But if you do, great. Until next time, I'm Julia Hatmaker. Have an excellent rest of your day.